I'd like to introduce you Veronka Vaspal, who graduated from History and Hungarian Linguistics and Literature in January 2010 at the Faculty of Humanities of Eötvös Loránd University, Budapest. In her history thesis, she was searching for the ways, possibilities, and individual motivations of consumption under the socialist era in Hungary. In her literature thesis, she was examining the poetic language of Lajos Partinagy, a well-known contemporary Hungarian artist, focusing on the relations between intertextuality and collective memory. Since 2007, she has been a volunteer and active member of the Hungarian NGO, the Association of Conscious Consumers, Tudatos Vásárlók Egyesülete. She worked in Porto, Portugal, for a tiny grassroots organization of environmental and cultural projects with rather anti-capitalist, anarchist, but non-violent features. The organization's aim was to build a strong community from below and without hierarchy, where people, regardless to their ethnicity or religion, trust each other and are able to exchange ideas, knowledge, goods, and services without using money.
Presentation, I would like to say two technical sentences. The first one is, this presentation contains language and violence that some viewers may find disturbing. It's intended for mature audiences only and shouldn't be viewed by young children. I kindly ask all young children to leave the room. And the other thing is that because my presentation is a linguistic study that I wrote on csibész kutyák, I will use this sign when I cite from the text, so that we don't have any misunderstanding. So this presentation will be an attempt to analyze the video called Rascal Dogs, Csibész kutyák of Digital Street from a linguistic, sociolinguistic and literary perspective. I will focus mainly on the text and the language of the chosen video. In other words, I take the lyrics as a phenomenon of a particular social cultural context upon which I shall reflect through the views and methods of literature and linguistics without having done anthropological fieldwork or qualitative sociological researches. Before we start, I would like to make some more comments on my choice on the video. A few days after the detailed program of this conference got published on romahiphopwebarchive.org, I received some comments saying that the analyzed video was not a track of dangerous elements, so I'm sorry my title is a little bit misleading, but that of Digital Street, that is Alcyon and dangerous elements featuring other MCs. I've appreciated the comments on the one hand because a discussion between us seems to have been started, and on the other because it made me realize that in this genre the question whose text is more ingenious, snappy, spirited is essential. The lyrics being the only original element in Hungarian hip-hop, because the basic for music, the wear, the dance and the gestures are all imported from America, is the sphere of constructing Roma hip-hop identity. After all, I find it important to put it accurately and apologize for my mistake in time. I chose Digital Street's Rascal Dogs video from YouTube, where at least 3 versions of the same track are available, and that made me confused. The track was the first piece of Digital Street and very soon became extremely popular in the 8th district, but not in mainstream media. Radio C and Ghetto Radio were regularly playing it, children were singing it in the school, it appeared as ringtones of mobiles, etc. I admit it made a deep effect on me as well, and I believe if we talk about contemporary culture, the process of reception is just as important as the text itself. Stanley Fish, an American critic, his theory about reading communities contends that all interpreters are extensions of communities. Since I have built on my own experience as a listener, my presentation will, could, and must merely provide one of the various possible interpretations. This approach, I believe, can maintain and sustain the pieces of Roma hip-hop as counterpoints of different interpretations, whether political or not. It's interesting that the majority of recent projects of the 8th district all have the common goal. They endeavor to make the 8th Roma inhabitants speak. They want to give them a voice. Blogs of the 8th encourage inhabitants to express their own opinion. The Street Art project of 2008 makes the inhabitants' messages visible, as well as the Photo Voice project, focusing on mainly children. Projects of Zöfi, from whom Moni was presenting this morning. In the district, for instance, the newspaper Magdi also served as a media for the inhabitants of the 8th. Until 2010, Ghetto Radio, from whom Norby is here, gives Roma hip-hop programs, which is followed by regular self-organized parties called Voice of the Street. Last but not least, sociologists also find it important to give a voice to 8th district Romans. In an entire book, Zoltán Tábori profoundly reports on living circumstances and lifestyle of the Magdolna quarter's inhabitants, speaking with them as much as possible. Marian Dósa, in her MA thesis, underlines that the Roma population involved in the process of the gentrification of the Corvin quarter had no voice, as a consequence of the state authorities' ignorance and negligence. Therefore, she decided to conduct interviews with them to hear their voice. Finally, I would like to mention a very fresh study, that of Vera Messing and Gábor Bernát, sociologists, who examine how Roma have recently been represented in the media. They consider the voice of Roma, that is their own individual and direct voice, as an important indicator of their real situation and career chances. After all, if one has a closer look at all these projects, it's hard not to believe that the act of speaking and consequently language wouldn't mean some kind of power or empowerment, which the mentioned projects aim to give back to Roma. Fortunately, the list of these sort of projects and studies could be continued, and now my desire would be to join these projects with my own analysis, even though my project is much smaller. And now I would like to ask you, those who speak Hungarian, to listen very carefully for the text of Csibész kutyák and enjoy. To put it very simple, critical cultural studies focuses on the interconnections of culture and politics within the context of everyday life. Gergő Pulai, anthropologist, examining the Hungarian Roma music scene, found that minorities often find a way to reposition themselves, and in certain cases they do it by the very same codes of modernity through which they had earlier been defined as different. Thus, the musical scene Pulai was observing can be considered as an alternative space where politics is being made. We should find his observation remarkable, firstly because it gives special significance to the music scene in terms of politics, and secondly because it implies that Roma music scene and as such Roma hip-hop could be also read or interpreted as politically meaningful. I argue that similarly to Hebd's profound study on punk, Hungarian Roma hip-hop as a vigorous combination of dance, music, argot and wear should be considered as a separate and sovereign subculture in Hungary, yet hardly studied. I found only a few linguistic approaches, studies on Hungarian Roma hip-hop yet. Unlike Hebdish, I would like to demonstrate the ways in which this subculture might be meaningful for the outsiders particularly. What sort of literary meaning and political meaning does Csibész kutyák transmit towards us, if any? The context of hip-hop is being constructed in a symbolic field of tension, a tension or opposition between us and them. Hip-hop is the expression or construction of identity of a particular group and promulgates profound digression. This is the main message that may be followed by further messages. I see digital street and in general Roma hip-hop and their musical activity as a construction of a special, let's say, double identity. The band members, in their lyrics, primarily define themselves as hip-hoppers, as I put it in the presentation. Here are the 4 crooks teaching you hip-hop. The translations are mine and not real American slang, but rather raw translations of the original text. So primarily they define themselves as hip-hoppers, but also as Roma. I was born as a gypsy, they say. Thus they become Roma and hip-hoppers, Roma hip-hoppers. The 4 cools, the 4 gizda, and the gangster slang. However, the mechanism of constructing identity and self-identity is certainly much more complicated than I just roughly scratched. The hip-hop language complexity, along with the mechanism of constructing self-identity in strong relation with power, will be explained in the following. So I argue that the cultural product Csibész kutyák bears or hides the features of power structures, but also as a consequence of the genre rap, these power structures can be revealed within and throughout the track's language use. My aim is to recover and present the levels on which the mentioned structures of power appear, as well as analyze as extensively as possible the instruments by which the video questions and symbolically subverts the actual power structures. My views are based on the Foucauldian power theory and Bourdieu's theory on language and symbolic power. I focus on the process of a certain group's or individuals' linguistic seclusion in Hungarian nyelv általi elkülönülés, because I see the examined phenomena Roma hip-hop as such. Moreover, in this presentation I understand all kinds of exclusion, discrimination, as processes that first and foremost manifest themselves through one's language use. Besides your skin color, it's the way you speak that makes you different. Hungarian sociolinguistic researches show that speakers of minorities very often perceive ethnic prejudices as a consequence of their language use. Namely, in terms of sociolinguistics, following the horizontal and vertical division of any language, in our case, the language of Roma in the 8th, and whether we regard it as a dialect or a group language, in any case, it has always been inferior to the vernacular in the everyday discourse. Argot and slang, for instance, but basically all non-official and non-written language variants have been subservient to the vernacular. A vernacular as a köznyelv, magyarul, whether we admit this or not. Additionally, in the case of Roma, whom the linguistic discourse also defines as Hungary's biggest and most underprivileged minority, language rights that are human rights as well, as Miklós Kontra points out, are shockingly damaged by the actual education policy, partly as a consequence of the lack of any Hungarian language policy or strategy. Minority groups, especially Roma, have constantly been affected by linguicism in Hungary, which means a group's discrimination based on their language use. Meanwhile, the official state-controlled public discourse has underlined, in relation to the languages spoken by Roma, the lack of vernacular, the too many different dialects, and that is basically only an oral culture anyway, as explanations or rather excuses for ignoring Roma's own languages in official life and education. I would like to suggest that Roma hip-hop as a subculture appears to be a firm opposition in terms of language against the above delineated discriminative language policy since the official language policy's language and Roma hip-hop's language are not understandable for one another. Hence, mutually they exclude one another. This is how linguistic seclusion works as a self-inducing mechanism within a society. Rap, before became a musical genre, it used to be a linguistic style, and it has never lost this meaning. Rapping or emceeing refers to spoken or chanted rhyming lyrics with a strong rhythmic accompaniment. MCs, as you see, parade with their improvisation ability and compete with each other. Hence, rap might be related to other traditional oral genres, such as the Portuguese fado, which has a particular type when two singers respond to each other and improvising, highly effective, but always with respect to the other person. I find it important also to reflect on the form of the performance that you see. The performance gives voice to each MCs. It is structured in a way that the performers have equal opportunity to present and speak for themselves. Thus, the structure of the performance suggests the idea of everyone's right and opportunity for speaking. It's the microphone that will appear as an instrument that gives the power to the actual speaker. See MC number 4, as the microphone empowers him. I grab the microphone in the hand, I grab it, I push it, here is a big smack in your face. Here, smack appears as a consequence of grabbing the microphone. In this way, the performance constructs their alternative way of power geometries. The way of performing one by one, but also all MCs together, offers the opportunity for the expression of individual and group identity at the same time. As the text begins, I don't know if you remember, it immediately creates a firm speech situation. The narrator speaks from a fictive radio, üdvözletemet adom minden tisztelt hallgatónak, giving the news from here, from misery, and the text is for you, which is the outside world. This basic context will be affirmed by each MC throughout the track, and this process will function as enhancement. The listener will feel the heaviness of the narrator's misery more and more as the track goes on. The whole text builds on the dichotomy of us and them. Similarly, by the way, what László Somogyi observes in his study on Fekete Vonat Black Train text. The speech context is extremely meaningful, in my opinion, as it summons an entire world of hierarchy structures and fundamentally questions the operation of our modern media as fair or something else. What does news mean anyway for one, and what it means to another? Which news are newsworthy and for whom? Who is supposed to give news to whom? The text constantly addresses the listener using the personal pronouns. This is what you need, it was you who made the row. Or using the vocative, believe me, remember this, bro. Moreover, the text poses questions to the listener. Why should I show you more? Tell me what you wanted from us. And even threatens him or her. You like it or not, I shoot you, I will make you all smart. However, the listener is not able to respond, first as he or she doesn't possess the necessary linguistic capital, so simply doesn't speak the same language variant with the MCs, and secondly, because listening to a video or a track is a linguistic process that doesn't give the opportunity for the listener to react. I'm trying to demonstrate the fact that Csibész Kutyák speaks a language that doesn't correspond with the recipients, with non-Roma or non-hip-hoppers. Hereby, the listener feels frustrated and miserable, at least I felt like that, because he or she is incapable to answer. In other words, the performance makes the recipient powerless. The depicted controversy between narrator and listener plays a pivotal role in the process of reception and is a key point to see the narrator's, the MC's, superiority in hip-hop that rises from ruling the language. I jack you with my rhymes and I shoot you, as another track entitled Hearts Fight puts it. Bourdieu, building on and complementing also John Austin's speech acts theory, points out that as a consequence of the normalization of the language, that is the evolution of the vernacular around the long 19th century, those who speak must ensure that they are entitled to speak in the right circumstances, and those who listen must reckon that those who speak are worthy of attention. Thus, the text of Csibész Kutyák breaks with this basic rule of linguistic interaction, which rule is strongly attached to the central uniformization of the language, any language. Therefore, we can interpret the performance that doesn't comply with more than 100-year-old unwritten laws. As the performance put it in the text, no one can say stop for them. Eventually, they can express themselves freely without having any linguistic difficulties that normally they do have as a consequence of the requirements of the possessives of power and knowledge. I would like to refer again to the beginning of the text, which defines the position of the narrator. And here we are again, giving news from misery. It says, "Misery, as the following lyrics makes that explicit, proves to be a metaphor for ghetto, the most important topos throughout the history of hip-hop, as well as a key theme of the analyzed performance. According to the text, ghetto is being depicted as a unique word which laws have remained unknown for outsiders so far. However, through this performance, the narrators as experts of this ghetto word, I always say the truth, what we have told you is the truth, reveal the secrets of this word for outsiders and offer an entry point for insiders. Interestingly enough, the text points it out as a fact that the addressed listeners already possess a knowledge about their ghetto word. You know, where you have homeless on the streets and pig on the square, or I know that's not good, still you see it, for instance. So we do have knowledge about this ghetto word. Building on the listener's knowledge on ghetto by such phrases, the text interacts with the everyday and social science discourse on ghetto that has recently been discussed by János Ladányi, Marian Dósa, and many others. I mentioned interaction as the text doesn't only summon these discourses, but also firmly responds on them, claiming that outsiders, in spite of their knowledge, still do not know the truth about the real ghetto word. The truth about the ghetto of Budapest, in the interpretation of Csibész Kutyák, is so incredible that it's rather similar to a television show. Thus, the linguistic representation of Csibész Kutyák writes up the phenomenon of ghettoization that strengthens both the contrast and the distance between Roma and non-Roma, including their knowledge on each other. This consequence of ghettoization is expressed in such oppositions as what is fair for you is just party for us, or Or it can be observed in another line, I live here where you have never been to. In that line, the contrast between me and you, so like the everyday discourse and the real experience is the most explicit. Therefore, in my interpretation, this line could be like a key line for the whole text. As Marian Dósa pointed out, physical segregation furthers existing prejudices against Roma people, since it reduces the association between the Roma and the non-Roma, which hinders the latter from forming a less biased first-hand view about Roma people. And in relation with the Topos ghetto, fight also plays an important role in the performance. I will never give up the fight. Fight for breaking out of the misery and fight for the truth, saying the truth always at all circumstances. I say the truth all the time, at the worst I die. Will be presented as an essential value and as such important part of the MC's identity. And now about the lexicon. I think it's the most interesting part. As I have presented so far, the different language capital, the different language variants that the narrators and the recipients speak is a key element in the reception of hip-hop. What makes the reception, the understanding even more difficult, at least it was for me, is the speed of speech and the lexicon the performers use. I will refer here only to a few speciality of the lexicon of Csibész-Kutyák to present the difficulties of unswitching the meaning of the text. Namely, I highlight the slang words on the screen that do not have a denotation in the vernacular, or if they do, that is a very different one. Csibész, kanyhaló, verebek vagytok, gizda, ráka bele, csináljátok meg, szoszi, bevarni. In English, in my own rote translation, you can see that on the right. We can see that the text uses elements of slang most of the time to describe the narrator's or the listener's characteristics. In terms of language, the narrator's relation with prisoners is remarkable. I highlighted the words with blue that are part of the Hungarian prison slang. The narrators speak the language of prisoners, the totalitarian institution of the majority that aims to repress, discipline the criminals and make them invisible. Also, the narrators, the Roma knowledge and experiences prisoners distinguish them from the majority and highlights the racism of jurisdiction. Prisoner slang recalls power structures and inverts them as the listeners, the majority, we who are listening to Csibész-Kutyák, we do not understand these words. Thus, most of the presented elements stand in the text as secrets for the speakers of the vernacular, and to make it even more complicated, I don't know if you remember, but the words that I mark with bold on the screen, they are used in the opposite meaning of their dictionary denotation in the text. Interestingly enough, two of these, gizda and kanyhaló, marked with star, are words of Roma origin. Gizda derives from gizdavo, that means proud in Romani, and at this point I think it relates to what Balázs and Moni and Jenő were talking about this morning, the Roma proudness. But in Hungarian, gizda appears with arrogant and weak, skinny denotations. Kanyhaló was a word that I didn't understand at all when I was listening to the text. It derives from the Romani kanyhi and refers to the guy who steals chickens, csirkefogó. According to the slang and prison slang dictionary, it means liar, untrustworthy, and in rustic speech it means rude rascal. Finally, Csibész, which by the way later migrated to the Czech argot Csibész. If there is anyone from Czech Republic here, then you should also recognize this word. It has originally also a pejorative meaning, just like gizda and kanyhaló, as it denotates a firstly goon, bandit, and also a naughty boy. In the case of Csibész, prison slang definitely helps us to understand its use. Csibész in the prison is a prisoner who exceeds the others in material, physical, mental, or other sense. All in all, Csibész is a cool person, at least in the prison and in Roma hip-hop. In addition, the title Rascal Dogs, Csibész kutyák, strengthens the set of pejorative connotations by using another firm pejorative element, dog, kutya, which is in Hungarian has a pejorative meaning. However, we see that the performers use Csibész, gizda, kanyhaló, and kutya, inverting the pejorative denotation, that of the dictionary, to a positive meaning, thus presenting their word and themselves as subversive energy. MCs believe that they have extraordinary linguistic ability, and now I believe too, and are experts of word formation, thus creating their own power through language use. Hip-hop artists constantly change word classes and meanings, resisting rigid categories by mixing different social acts, resulting in a sense of chaos, movement, and urgency. And finally, I will speak about the stereotypes the text comes up with, and the verbal aggression it uses, because as you were listening to the video, the guys at the back, they were helping me to censor the text. And so at 2 points the text brings up the issue of being stigmatized by the majority in an extremely open, provocative way. I was born as a mad gypsy, and gypsies are mad, which influences the whole text. Therefore, I shall reflect upon that. If we have a look at the broad collection of Hungarian phrases and proverbs on Roma, we will see the majority society's stereotypical approach towards them. They exaggerate certain characters of Roma, ironize and joke on them, and thus language works for maintaining power structures. According to proverbs, in the eyes of the Hungarians, Roma appear as cunning, losers and clumsy, bad in terms of Christian morals, dishonest, brash, avaricious, ridiculous, black, poor and hungry, which one can conclude on how they treat their horses. According to these proverbs that I examined, they do not want to work, or they do not like working as such. And I found only one proverb presenting a positive stereotype, that they are very good musicians. But even this one is doubtful. Is someone a good musician because of his or her Roma origin, or because of his or her talent? Also, the relation which can be observed in the linguistic form of the proverbs is rather disdainful, humiliating, gloating upon them from the majority. And although these proverbs are fading away nowadays, the stereotypes they summon have much longer lives, and they continue ruling the everyday discourse of today. I have cited all those proverbs just to picture that the line, when Csibész kutyák says, I was born as a mad gypsy, or even the word itself, gypsy, inevitably summons a whole world of connotations and stereotypes in the mind of the listener. The text starts playing with the evoked connotations. The title Csibész kutyák recalls the phrase veszett kutya, on which the line veszett cigány will play. Sorry, everything is quoted. Thus, all the possible denotations and connotations of these phrases will circulate between each other, strengthening each other's effect. For example, between kutya and cigány, a new relation will appear. The depicted sets of lexicon will eventually lead to identifying rascal dogs with mad gypsies. Other phrases that recalls the mentioned stereotypes on Roma, such phrases as I follow my blood, I be ready and awake all the time, gypsies are mad. I took them for a mug, and so I got your money. These phrases we relate to the very same circle of meaning of rascal dogs, mad gypsy, etc. The fact that in certain speech situations, especially in the case of self-definition, Roma use external names and internalize external stereotypes, that of the majority, is very much similar what Andrea Szalai, linguistic, observed in a bilingual Roma community. She found that the community's language use regarding Roma, non-Roma opposition, we and they, as well as naming certain Roma groups, are all very much appropriate to the majority's definitions. Csibész kutyák also internalizes the majority's external connotations and stereotypes on Roma. Moreover, it does that openly and provocatively, scandalizing that in a way that shocks the listeners, making them realize how shocking it can actually be to born as a mad gypsy. The performance is certainly shocking also because of the verbal aggression it uses. At some points, the text even threatens the listeners. Regarding rascal dogs, csibész kutyák, I would rather agree with those who question the established opinion of hip-hop being a non-violent, non-aggressive way of protest. However, through the results of multidisciplinary aggression questing, we can understand the function of verbal aggression in hip-hop in relation to power. Verbal aggression is the most typical form and way of expression of practicing power over others. At the same time, verbal aggression can indicate the lack of power. Furthermore, it is often the fight for power that causes verbal aggression. And last but not least, practicing verbal aggression constantly, just like csibész kutyák does, might be a way of keeping the power. In relation to the mentioned stereotypes on Roma that the text writes up, verbal aggression expresses outrage, inertness, powerlessness on the level of language. Last but not least, it is rather telling that swearing, curing, insulting words and abuse were all punished in the 17th century, in early modern ages in Europe. These acts break taboos of the community, thus causing instability in the normal established life of the village. As Foucault depicts in the history of sexuality, the vernacular cleaned itself through the centuries from taboos, including swearing words, and established the discipline middle-class vernacular as normal. The analyzed track challenges this process, in my opinion, and questions the set rules on clean and correct language use. Hereby, csibész kutyák inverts what Bourdieu and Foucault claims on the nature of symbolic power and symbolic violence, and this is what you can see on the screen. According to Bourdieu, symbolic power is an invisible power which is misrecognized as such and thereby recognized as legitimate. In the case of csibész kutyák, that is to say that symbolic power is a visible power which is recognized easily as such and thereby recognized as an illegitimate, subverting existing and never questioned power structure. We know from Bourdieu and Foucault that in modern society symbolic violence has been built into the institutions themselves and that the whole mechanism needs active complicity on the part of those subjected to it. Csibész kutyák makes this kind of mechanism shockingly explicit. And finally, my conclusions, and then I will finish. I know it's rather difficult to follow linguistic research in English. Conclusions. I hope that my analysis has been able to demonstrate that Roma hip-hop should be considered as a particular and sovereign subculture which is capable for constructing a firm group identity of the 8th district of Budapest, but also for expressing individual self-identity. If we examine the lyrics profoundly, which I did, we will have no doubt that in the sphere of Roma hip-hop subculture, alternative politics appear. That is the symbolic but firm questioning of the operation of the media, the refuse of the ethnic prejudices based on a group's language use, the general criticism of the normalization and uniformization of the vernacular, which is equal with the exclusion of dialects, obscene lexicon, slang, etc. Since Roma of the age is not able to make part of the discourse of power and knowledge, they create their own different language with their own secrets and rules. In terms of literature, this new language or different language challenges those profound aesthetic conventions that are fundamental of our modernity, but also questions the legitimacy of high culture and the segregation of high culture from low culture. Furthermore, the track demonstrates very well the mechanism of stereotypes on Roma, reflects on the we-you opposition of society, demonstrating the stereotypes' effect on constructing their own Roma identity. The track reinscribes a political, economical, sociological phenomena, ghettoization, and unfortunately seems to prove Foucault's theory on the biopolitics of the population, in which race appears as the central object of the modern political state. Criminality, madness, and anomalies are conceptualized in racial terms in today's society, just like Jana was talking about in the morning. Adding to all this, taking Bourdieu's theory into consideration too, that says that language use is determined by the state of the body. See, for example, one's accent that is inscribed upon one's body. One can understand why the line, I was born as a mad gypsy, sounds so piercingly as it does, emerging from the entire text as such. And so if in the beginning I said that the lyrics bears or hides certain power structures, hereby I claim that the text harshly unstretches and destroys these power structures, yet apparently only symbolically and only for as long as we hear the track. Thank you for your attention, and many thanks to Norbi, Tanka, Pepino, Kish Pepino, Mr. Joint and Kata for their help and support.